This is a human femur, or thigh bone, and this is the whole human leg. Well, it's a lot of a human leg. It's missing sort of the tender and squishy outer coating. It's the crunchy center of a human leg, the skeletal portion. I love bones and I love teeth. And not just because their aesthetic goes so hard, they also preserve a lot of information. And because they're so durable, they preserve that information through time. We can use the bones and teeth of an individual hundreds of millions of years after they died to reconstruct how they moved and what they ate. What that means is that in 50 million years, the octopus overlords of this planet will be able to reconstruct your sedentary lifestyle and your sugar intake. Bone mistakes are forever mistakes, so go on a run and eat some spinach. One of the big things that separates humans from other living apes is how we move. We walk upright on 2 feet, bipedally, more or less all the time. So we have this question: when in our evolutionary history did that happen, and why? Provided we can actually find them, bones can help us answer that question. And some of the most informative bones for locomotion, or how one moves, are, of course, the limbs. A new Miocene ape femur has just been published out of Europe at 7.2 million years of age, and it shows some tantalizing features linking it to a form of bipedalism. That's really cool, and we're going to talk about it and some of the implications, as well as what it could possibly have to do with Bulgarian origins for humans. You might already know, but let's get started. The Miocene is an epoch of the Neogene period, and the Neogene period is a period within the Cenozoic era, or the age of mammals. Humans are thought to have split from our closest living relatives, the chimpanzees and bonobos, or the pannins, approximately 7 million years ago. And the Miocene as an epoch lasts from about 23 million years ago to about 5 million years ago, which means that the tail end of the Miocene is where we find the first hominins, or apes, on the human side of that human-chimp split. And that makes the Miocene a pretty important span of time to study. I bet the people who are professionally investigating it are so cool and don't ever embarrass themselves in their local communities.
Another day! Another sleigh!
There are 5 big general categories of things that separate humans from other living apes, meaning that these characteristics need to emerge slowly over time across that 7 million years since our split with our closest living relatives. Those characteristics are big brains, little canine teeth that don't keep themselves sharp and are the same sizes between males and females, a really slow development time, a complicated tool culture, and bipedalism, or walking upright. It's pretty well understood that out of those 5 characteristics, generally the last 3 characteristics to develop are those big brains, that slow development time, and that complicated tool culture, showing up pretty slowly from Australopithecus, or Lucy's genus, onward. While those other 2 characteristics, small, non-honing, monomorphic canine teeth, and bipedalism, are thought to have emerged earlier in human evolution, closer to that split. Part of the reason for this tempo is that when we look at genus Australopithecus, again, Lucy's genus, we see an interesting mix of these characteristics. Temporally, genus Australopithecus starts around 4.4 million years ago and lasts to about 2 million years ago. Really, it's like 1.9 with Australopithecus sediba, meaning it's smack dab in the middle of our evolutionary history. We would expect for this genus to occupy then an intermediate or transitional state of being between us and our Miocene ape ancestors, and indeed, we do. Australopithecus grew up like apes. It had a relatively small brain, still bigger than what we see for chimpanzees, but nowhere near what we see in ourselves or even in later members of genus Homo. They used tools, but they weren't particularly complicated. However, Australopithecus did have small non-honing canine teeth that were the same size between the sexes, and Australopithecus as a genus was fully bipedal when it was on the ground. And when we reconstruct its habitats, it seems like it was on the ground quite often. That means, of course, that small non-honing canine teeth that are monomorphic, and bipedalism must emerge in between the last common ancestor that we share with chimpanzees and Australopithecus. Right? I mean, right? Right? Say right. Say right now. We know now that evolution is not linear, and human evolution is no exception. It isn't like a ladder where one thing definitively evolves into another thing, which definitively evolves into another thing in this nice stepwise fashion, but rather lineages evolve over time, adapting in unique ways, going in strange, bizarre directions depending on where and when they're living. They're not evolving in any given direction towards something in particular. Ancient three-toed horses weren't trying to evolve into a modern one-toed horse. They were killing it as ancient three-toed horses. Ancient legged whales weren't trying to evolve into modern legless whales. They were slaying as legged whales. And ancient Miocene apes weren't trying to evolve into modern human apes. They were mogging as ancient Miocene apes. Am I connecting with you, the youth? I realize this is the second video in a row that I've used mog as a punchline, but I'm trying really, really hard to force you to find this stuff interesting. I should just have Subway Surfer playing while I'm speaking, but I'm too proud for that. It's possible that bipedalism is limited to just the hominins. I would say that it's pretty likely that our particular type of bipedalism and the frequency in which we engage in bipedalism is probably limited to hominins like Australopithecus and later. But is it reasonable to propose that bipedalism is limited to hominins, period? Two important things are true, and we have to take them into consideration when we're asking this question. One, all other apes can and in fact do walk upright on 2 feet sometimes. And two, when we look at the fossil record, current evidence suggests that the last common ancestor of the great apes, at least, was probably an arboreal suspensory animal or an arboreal careful clamberer, which means it was in the trees holding its body upright. My favorite hypothesis for the origin of bipedalism is that you essentially have a pretty generic Miocene ape that's upright in the trees, and then the climate changes. You take away the trees. And so you have an upright ape in the trees without the trees, which is now an upright ape on the ground. And it's just easier to adapt to the posture you currently have instead of readapting a more intermediate posture and knuckle walking. In a nutshell, I don't believe that human evolution contained a knuckle walking phase. I think we were already upright in the trees because we were hanging below the branches or carefully moving through them, and then the trees went away, and so we just stayed upright on the ground. And the support that I think exists for this is twofold. One, we don't have any Miocene apes that were evidently knuckle walkers. None. Of the dozens and dozens of species from this epoch, we don't have a single knuckle walker. And two, the type of knuckle walking that chimpanzees and gorillas engage in is different, meaning they likely evolved it separately. It's convergent evolution, a different type of knuckle walking for chimps than the one that developed or evolved for gorillas. Now, during the Miocene, those dozens and dozens of species of apes that I just mentioned, they lived everywhere. They lived in Europe, they lived in Asia, they lived in Africa. There were many, many, many different types of apes experimenting in different ways, and they were able to do this because the Miocene was super duper warm, and these large forests were able to stretch all the way to Germany and beyond. The habitats that are good for apes were ubiquitous. The Miocene climatic optimum, or peak Miocene living time for apes, was about 16 million years ago, after which things start to rapidly cool and all those forests begin to disappear. This is probably common knowledge, but the warmest and wettest portion of the Earth is along the equator, typically, meaning when it starts to cool, those are the places that hold on to that warm, wet temperature for the longest, and at the poles, or closer to the poles, the warmer areas grow colder faster. In some, the forest cover shrinks starting at the northerly and southerly areas of the planet and contracting towards the center. If there are upright apes in the trees at the equator and also far to the north and also all in between, and then the climate starts taking away the trees starting at the north and then moving towards the equator, what's going to happen to all those apes? Well, hypothetically, they're going to go extinct, or they're going to get bipedal so that they can better traverse the newly grassy patches in between the remaining forests of trees. I feel like that makes sense intuitively. I feel like that's a fair hypothesis. But if that can happen, and I don't think that there's a reason proposed why it couldn't, how do we actually tell the difference between Miocene apes that have some bipedal adaptations due to a changing climate and bona fide hominins that would go on to yield us? Would that just make them hominins? And if we found these bipedal adaptations in Miocene apes, and those Miocene apes lived in, like, not Africa, would that kill the out of Africa hypothesis? If those remains were found in, say, Bulgaria, would that mean that out of Bulgaria is probably a better way to conceive of human evolution? No, because out of Africa, the hypothesis typically surrounds the species Homo sapiens, or at the very least, genus Homo, both of which are very solidly placed in continental Africa with regard to fossils and genetics. Homo is more broad than Homo sapiens, and hominin is more broad than Homo. And hominine, which is the African apes, including gorillas, chimps, and humans, that's more broad than hominin. So if we were to find the oldest hominine or the oldest hominin, and they were in, like, Bulgaria, saying that out of Africa is now out of Bulgaria is just as goofy as saying that because the oldest primate is found in the United States, that out of Africa should actually be out of America. Yeehaw! There is a new femur from Bulgaria. It does belong to a Miocene ape, and it does show some bipedal adaptations that we're going to talk about here in a second. The authors know that those characteristics does not make it a hominin and does not mean that out of Bulgaria is how we should conceive of human evolution. Pop science article writers, I must believe, also know this, but they specifically hate me and know that their clickbait titles shave actual years off of my life. That is the only reason why they would be pushing this narrative, unless they just didn't read the paper, but they would never do that. Folks on Twitter, on the other hand, which I'm back on because I'm promoting videos there and I hate myself, I guess, are taking this in a different, much more predictable direction.
Ooh, yeah,
God, dude, Twitter is acting racist? No, that can't be. That can't be true. I just don't believe it. Clickbait article titles aside, if this femur does in fact show bipedal characteristics consistent with hominins, does that mean that the hominin group began out of Africa and migrated back in? Does this femur have bipedal adaptations consistent with hominins? The paper is titled An Early Form of Terrestrial Hominine Bipedalism in the Late Miocene of Bulgaria, and it is by Spasov and colleagues. You'll notice that David Berrigan is the last author there. He is sort of the familiar name on this list for English speakers interested in the Miocene apes. And I'll add, notice in the title, it does not say an early form of terrestrial hominin bipedalism in the late Miocene of Bulgaria, but hominine, and that is a different thing. Hominins are typically going to be all of the apes that are more closely related to humans than our closest living relative, the chimpanzees and the bonobos, while a hominine is going to be any African ape. So anything closely related to humans or chimpanzees and bonobos or gorillas, to the exclusion of orangutans. Hominine is one level more specific than hominid, which is all the great apes. It's basically everything but orangs and their relatives. Now, I'm going to say really quickly right off the bat that you might be getting deja vu if you've been involved in this circle, interested in this circle for the past 20 years. Because this has happened before, that we've had a version of bipedalism proposed for Miocene apes in Europe rather than in Africa being exclusive to hominins, or again, our lineage. We've seen bipedalism, at least a version of it, be proposed for Oreopithecus before, as well as Danuvius, who live in Tuscany and Germany, respectively. So let's begin, as always, with the abstract and see whether or not we're looking at anything majorly substantial here, something that is non-controversial, which it rarely is. The abstract begins with fossils of Auroran record the first convincing evidence of hominid terrestrial bipedalism in the late Miocene at about 6 million years ago. Bipedalism in the slightly older 7 million year old Sahelanthropus has recently been called into question. Okay, we're gonna have to pause there. Like I said, hominins split from pannins about 7 million years ago, or if we're using the molecular clock, only about 6.5 million years ago. So let's call it 6 to 7 million years ago. We have two candidate hominins, or fossil apes, that are proposed to be on our side of the split, albeit kind of barely. The first, you know, if you've been around here for any period of time, that's Sahelanthropus chidensis. If you want to know the scoop with Sahelanthropus, please check out this video where I crib a lot from Scott Sayer's wonderful article on this hominin and talk a little bit about why I think it is a hominin, but again, barely. This is something that is moving upright, probably a little bit on the ground, but it does seem to have those reduced canine teeth, so I'm giving it benefit of the doubt and calling it a hominin. After Sahelanthropus at 6 million years of age, we have Auroran tuganensis, who's known primarily from postcranial material, mostly femora, or femurs, and it does seem to have a lot of diagnostic characteristics that are reminiscent of the later genus Australopithecus, suggesting that this thing did, in fact, spend time walking on 2 feet. It also has those reduced canine teeth. Now, I'm going to say, I think non-controversially, that the oldest hominin that we have that is sort of unequivocally a hominin, that most people are going to agree is a hominin and isn't going to fight you on, is going to be members of genus Ardipithecus, around 5.7-ish, with Ardipithecus cadaba at the oldest and lasting until 4.4 million years of age with Ardipithecus ramidus. It's worth asking, why is Ardipithecus ramidus the oldest non-controversial hominin? I think it's pretty simple. It's because we have a lot of this genus. We have a really solid partial skeleton and a lot of additional material so that we have a pretty good idea of the entire animal, not just bits and pieces of it. That's going to be important for later, I think. The abstract continues. Here, we present the first known hominine postcranial element from Asmaki, Bulgaria, a 7.2 million year old nearly complete femur, which we tentatively attribute to genus Gracopithecus. The Asmaka hominine represents a candidate for an ancestral form of positional behavior from which bipedalism documented in later hominins evolved. That is a pretty strong statement. The Asmaka femur lacks many of the specialized attributes of arboreal quadrupeds. At the same time, the combination of locomotor features of this femur indicate a complex locomotor repertoire. Qualitative and quantitative morphological analyses demonstrate the Asmaka femur combines certain attributes of terrestrial quadrupeds and bipeds and clusters mostly with early bipeds and partially with African apes. That is what you would expect from an early hominin or from something that is right before hominins split off, to be fair. They say the morphology indicates a transitional form of bipedalism. Period. The woodland grassland savanna environment of the early Mycenaean locality of Asmaka suggests that a terrestrial bipedalism likely evolved in a non-forested setting. Non-controversial, I agree. I've posited something similar in this very video. They say the early Mycenaean stage is critical to our understanding of mammalian paleobiogeography and the intercontinental dispersal between Eurasia and Africa. We hypothesize that the descendants of the Asmaka hominine may have dispersed from Eurasia into Africa under the influence of climatic and environmental changes in the eastern Mediterranean. If such dispersal occurred, it may have been associated with a subsequent reoccupation of more forested settings in both the ancestors of African apes and hominins. Okay, they've got a femur. It's older than the oldest thing that we have that might be a hominin, that being Sahelanthropus chirensis at 7 million years ago. Sahelanthropus lived in Central Africa. Here we have something that's 200,000 years older with arguably more features related to bipedalism in the femur, and it is in Bulgaria. They are not arguing that this thing is a hominin, but rather a hominine, so an African ape that potentially is the common ancestor of the other African apes and humans. This has implications. Obviously, this would mean that the last common ancestor of humans, chimps, bonobos, and gorillas was positionally, at least, like how it holds its body, more similar maybe to us than to gorillas, chimps, and bonobos. It also means that that last common ancestor, and potentially even hominins, evolved outside of Africa and moved back in as that climate was changing and pushing those apes back into places that still had forests. So already here, the headline is African apes evolved in Bulgaria, not human origins is out of Bulgaria instead of out of Africa. That much is clear from the authors themselves, confirming, as we suspected, that this was a spin done on behalf of, like, Twitter dwellers and pop science articles. But is it true? That is the question. Okay. Let's continue on with the abstract here. I'm going to do a lot of summarizing because this is actually a pretty long article, a pretty good article. I disagree with some of it, but that's okay. That's allowed. First, they summarize where we're at with regard to where and when bipedalism evolved and where and when hominines and hominins respectively evolved. And they're basically like, no one can agree. We can all agree pretty much, as I said earlier, that Ardipithecus, the genus, at 5.8 they say here, is probably our oldest known facultative biped. Facultative bipedalism means that you do move upright on 2 feet some of the time. And I would argue that facultative bipedalism in paleoanthropology typically means more than what you would see other non-human apes doing today. So Ardipithecus cadaba isn't moving 2 feet wise as often as chimps do, but probably far more than that, which is something that's supported by the type of environment that they live in, which would have required it. So not only could they do it based off of their anatomy, but they would have had to based off of where they live. Then they go on to say, some people have argued that Gracopithecus, the subject of today, might be a hominin. And then they're like, but most people dispute that. And then they conclude by saying, nevertheless, recent analyses converge on the view that the late Miocene area of the Balkans and Anatolia is probably home to our first African apes. So African apes evolved not in Africa, seems to be the consensus so far. I have thoughts on that. I think it is fair to say that at present, it definitely looks that way. But I don't know if it looks that way because that's the truth of the matter, and African apes do have an origin in Europe, or Eurasia more broadly speaking, or if it's because the African fossil record for this section of time is just so dog water that we actually did have apes doing similar things in Africa at this time, and we just haven't found them yet, or they didn't preserve at all. Hopefully not the latter. I can appreciate that that might seem a little just so off the dome, but knowing a couple of people who are working in the areas that we should be finding Miocene apes in Africa around this time period, like I think they're probably there. I think that they're undersampled at present, and it won't be that way forever. That does not mean that hominines didn't begin in Europe and then move downward back into Africa, because the types of apes that we are finding in Africa are pretty primitive, right? Like Equatorius doesn't look a whole lot different from the Miocene apes from the earlier Miocene that preceded, and it's like more in the middle Miocene. Like it seems like the derived stuff is showing up in Eurasia, so like it's possible that they did move down and replace the more primitive Miocene apes still hanging out in Africa. I digress. I really could talk about the minutiae of the Miocene apes all day, but we're talking about the femur that you can see on your screen right now, in particular the Osmaka femur, dated to 7.2 million years ago, belonging to probably Gracopithecus, and it's a beautiful little fossil, as you can see. The entire proximal portion of the femur, or virtually the entire portion of the proximal femur, that upper portion of the thigh bone, is preserved. You've got a lot of the shaft. The distal portion, not so good. Obviously, the part where the knee is not really there for the most part. You get a little bit of it at the tail end there, but not so much. And then we get this beautiful comparison of the cross sections of that femoral neck, which is going to be really important here in a second. I'm going to go through it, maybe even right off the bat. We'll see. So, what is it about this femur that tells us it belonged to something that was bipedal at least some of the time? First and foremost, it's the neck. It's the head and the neck of the femur. And this is going to be what they point out in their summary in the discussion at the end too. But when you compare the Osmaka femur to Australopithecus afarensis' femur there to a chimpanzee femur or a member of genus Pan, you can see that that neck is long, the head is small, much more similar to what we see in Australopithecus than what we see in Pan. But notably, it is intermediate, right? You can look at it, it sits pretty fairly in between what we see with chimps and what we see with Australopithecus. So it's not clearly hominin, but it's more similar to a hominin than it is to living non-human hominines, which that's kind of important. A lot of times we ask this question with fossils, and I think it's a fair question to ask. If something could do something, does that mean it did do that thing? And this is where that cross-section of the femoral neck comes in. Bone is really cool for a lot of reasons that I mentioned earlier, but another reason that we can add to the list is that it can remodel itself. Wolff's law is a law of biomechanics, I guess, is probably how you would best put it, which essentially states that bone will respond to stressors, to force, to loadings, and it will remodel itself in accordance with habitual chronic stress. Meaning, if you're like a tennis player, you're going to be able to clock that on an x-ray of your right arm versus your left arm if you're right-handed. Your bone is going to remodel in response to repeated loadings. And specifically, you can see this in both types of bone. In the cortical bone, which is the outer portion of the bone, the hard stuff, and in the trabecular bone or the spongy bone. And in humans, this has a specific pattern in our femoral neck because of how we move, because we are bipedal. You can actually see it in this cartoon of a femur. You can see the cortical bone on the inferior or underside of the femoral neck is much thicker than on the superior or upper portion of the femoral neck, because this lower portion is the one that's taking all the stress of being upright. And we have this lovely little cortical bone comparison, or I should say cross-section comparison that includes both cortical bone and the trabecular or spongy bone. This picture right here is a slice, a virtual slice, or digital slice, I should say, right at the femoral neck. So you take a CT scan and then you look at that slice right here in the middle of the femur, and it lets you see the distribution of cortical bone without having to actually break the fossil in half. And the comparison that they're making here is H, which is going to be our Osmaki femur, I, which I believe is a hominin, then you have J, which is Mesopithecus, a colobine, a fossil colobine, or monkey, I should say, and K, which is a chimp, a Pan. It's obvious to see, but I'll highlight with my cursor just in case. Here's that thickened cortical bone on the inferior portion of the neck of the Osmaki femur of this human. I believe it's specifically a Roman burial. I said hominin a minute ago. I could have been more specific. Mesopithecus, but Mesopithecus has this bizarre sort of shape to it, and of Pan. Of these three, the Osmaki femur looks most like the Roman burial. H looks most like I. J and K are odd men out. J in part due to the shape, and K due to the shape and the cortical bone distribution. You might be wondering, like, what the hell is actually up with Mesopithecus? And it's argued to be, if memory serves, like a vertical leaper sometimes. So that might be why it's got this asymmetric cortical bone distribution. But I think you'd want to see a comparison of that to an injury, like something that vertically leaps today, to actually confirm. Either way, it doesn't matter because Grecopithecus here, H and I are clearly the most similar to one another. And that means that the bone has actually been remodeled in life as a response to what this animal is actually doing, which was evidently at least some bipedal locomotion, more than what we see for chimps today. Those characteristics are really hominin-like. So why aren't the authors saying it's a hominin? Well, let's go through it, because it turns out the scant hominin signals are kind of overpowered by these general hominine signals. So they say the features leave no doubt that this thing belongs to a hominid. So it's definitely a great ape. It's not like a gibbon, and it's not like a cercopithecoid baboon or colobine like Mesopithecus. They go through bit by bit as to what they have and compare it, not just by eyeballing it, but they run some measurements and some statistical analyses to see where this thing actually falls. And I'd like to walk through some of that with you now. They talk qualitatively about a lot of the characteristics, meaning they describe and say, the head of the femur's size was most similar to these taxa, right? But I think that visually it's a little bit easier here. This is open access. You can go and check out for yourself sort of the details of the comparative analysis here, or just comparisons in general. But I'm going to show you the visuals because I think they sort of hammer this home best. So this is a diagram here, a figure that shows the neck shaft angle, so the angle of the femoral neck, how it comes in and meets the shaft of the bone. And then we're looking at that angle in a lot of different taxa, and then the Osmaki femur is here in red. So Hylobates, that's going to be our gibbons. Pongo, those are our orangutans. They are way off to the side. Like their femoral neck shaft angle is a lot higher than what we're seeing in the Osmaki femur. Gorillas, it overlaps. Pantroglodytes, common chimps, no overlap. Panpeniscus, a little bit of overlap. No overlap with Rudopithecus, a little bit of overlap with Paranthropus, a lot of overlap with Australopithecus afarensis. Actually, the most amount of overlap there. And then a tiny, teeny little bit with Homo sapiens, or rather genus Homo in general, probably including Erectus and the like here. And then the rest of the Miocene apes, or a lot of our Miocene apes, are kind of all over the place in Hispanopithecus and Dryopithecus and Danuvius. Australopithecus africanus is like a little bit close, and Roran is a little bit close too. So neck shaft angle, most like Australopithecus afarensis, I would say. There's a bipedal signal here for sure. And we see some convergence with gorillas, even though they're not actually engaging in bipedalism. Figure 8 has the femoral neck oblique length, and we're looking at the actual length of the femoral neck in this left box and whisker plot, again with those same taxa, and in the right box and whisker plot, we're taking those taxa and categorizing most of them by how they actually move. So let me walk you through this. First, the Osmaki femur is just like right on point, matching with genus Homo amongst all of these taxa with regard to the femoral neck length. So it looks like genus Homo. That's a strong bipedal signal to the exclusion of everything else, but we kind of already talked about that. And when you condense all of these taxa into how it is that they're actually moving, so you combine all the knuckle walkers, all the suspensory animals, all the bipeds, and then the ones that we can't as easily classify, again, it's mapping right with those bipedal locomotors, with the bipedal hominins to the exclusion of everything else. So that tells us, again, we're looking at a pretty good signal that this thing was moving upright some of the time. The very next set of plots presents an extremely similar signal, but instead of looking at the length of the neck, we're looking at the femoral head and greater trochanter distance. So the distance of not just the neck, but of the femoral head to the greater trochanter of the femur, which is the larger sort of lump on the top of the femur itself. And again, it maps first most with Homo, although it is in the range. It's kind of off tailing behind. It's not matching specifically within like near the mean of genus Homo, but rather kind of in that in-between area, almost where we would expect for something that's kind of engaging in bipedalism some of the time, but not all of the time. And then same similar situation where it's mapping mostly with the bipeds, but almost in that space in between a knuckle walker and a biped, or in between a suspensory animal in the biped. How transitional. Again, though, we're talking about specifically the neck with all of those plots, the area that's argued to be the most hominin-like. So it's not surprising that it's plotting with the hominins. The multivariate analysis is going to take into account like 12 different femoral variables and include all of them to see what the Osmaka femur looks most like. And I got my notes here from when I read this paper for the first time. We're talking about characteristics like the trochanteric fossa, the obturator groove, the greater trochanter, the lesser trochanter, the intertrochanteric crest, the gluteal tuberosity, the linea aspera, and the cortical bone. Those aren't the 12 specific features, but we're talking about including aspects of those features to get a better picture of the proximal femur as a whole. That was done using a principal component analysis. A principal component analysis is a statistical means by which we can summarize the variation within a data set by finding the orthogonal axes which capture the most amount of variation. And those orthogonal axes are also known as the principal components. It's basically a way to take data, usually shape data, and reduce the complexity of it into a comprehensible way. I hope that makes sense. What we're looking at here is a PCA. We're looking at the first two principal components because you get a lot of different principal components. You usually only keep the ones that are going to summarize the most amount of variance. It looks like we're looking at about 60% of variance with these first two principal components here. That's a lot of detail you don't really need to know. Basically, it's a way to see shape-wise where our Osmaki femur actually maps in comparison to a lot of other taxa. So it looks like we're comparing the Osmaki femur, which is located here, and it's falling right in the general shape space of Pan troglodytes or the chimpanzee when all of these are taken into account. It is closest to a roran, our hominin Rorantuganensis. It's pretty close to Paranthropus as well, and it's also kind of close to, looks like Equatorius here, which is a Miocene ape. Overall, this thing is clearly not a hominin, but it shares some features with the most primitive of hominins, with Rorantuganensis. And we see the same thing here when we plot it with our, this is like a crazy figure here, when we take, again, those species, those living taxa, and assign them based off of how they're moving. So we sort of condense chimps, bonobos, and gorillas into a group, the knuckle walkers, gibbons and orangutans into a group, our suspensory guys, and all our hominins into the bipedal group. And we see that the Osmaki femur is right in the area of overlap for knuckle walkers and bipeds. I realize I said Osmaki femur. I hope I've been saying it Osmaka most of the time, because it is Azmaka, Osmaka femur. Anyways, you can see why it's important to take more than just a couple of derived features into account. Because if you were only looking at the neck, you'd be like, oh yeah, this is a hominin. But when you take everything into account, it's like just outside the hominin group. It's right in that area of overlap. And that has some interesting implications. They include a CVA in this paper as well. A CVA stands for Canonical Variant Analysis, and this basically takes those PCs and finds the best combination, the linear combination of those PCs, which best separate groups that are pre-established. So they're basically like, okay, how can we best separate out bipeds and suspensory apes and our knuckle walkers? And then they separate those out, and then they say, with this in mind, where does the Osmaka femur actually fall? And as you can see, again, it seems to fall right in this area of overlap, but just barely between our knuckle walkers and our bipeds. So along CV2, which is here on the y-axis, it's just barely in with the bipeds, and along CV1, which is our x-axis, it's just barely in with the knuckle walkers. Now, it's worth noting here, and I cannot stress this enough, you don't clock a knuckle walker by its femur. The femur is telling you really not that the Osmaka femur shares a lot in common with knuckle walkers, but with things that are quadrupedal, things that aren't suspensory and also aren't bipedal along this axis. Because remember, we don't have any knuckle walking Miocene apes. The only knuckle walkers that we know of are the extant gorillas, chimps, and bonobos. In sum, the Osmaka femur looks mostly like a generic African ape or hominine femur, with just a handful of characteristics that pull it towards the hominins. Or is it maybe fair to say that a couple of characteristics that allow you to be a decent biped might be the ancestral condition, and that African apes have derived more from that and hominins have derived more from that, respectively, in their own directions, to become both fully fledged knuckle walkers and fully fledged bipeds? Might that be a fair way to interpret this? There's a lot of great comparative stuff in here that I'd love to take the time to go over, but we'd be here all day, and I'm trying to be briefer so that I can work on other important stuff in my life. The authors do a really good job comparing the material that they have available to other hominins, hominines, hominids, and hominoids for which we have material, comparing it in all the ways really that are appropriate, including utilizing Owen Lovejoy's sort of list of criteria for bipedalism in part that was applied to Australopithecus afarensis, and it consistently falls in as something that was probably capable of some form of facultative bipedalism, but nothing like what we would see for Australopithecus afarensis. Again, most similar to Auroran, or as they say here, early bipeds like Auroran. There is specifically this long section on Sahelanthropus chilensis here where they say special attention is warranted to the comparison with the slightly younger in age Sahelanthropus, the first putative hominin. And they basically say, going through trait by trait in what is comparable, they're like the Osmaka femur is at least as bipedal as Sahelanthropus is argued to be. They say, considering the aforementioned morpho-functional features of the Osmaka femur, we conclude that the Osmaka hominine was at least that much, but probably more strongly adapted to a bipedal lifestyle than Sahelanthropus, although we cannot speak of habitual bipedalism. And this is a little bit curious to me. Put a pin in that. I've scooched down a little bit into the positional behavior of the Osmaka hominine, and they finish this section discussing how it doesn't have these specialized suspensory arboreal characteristics, and that a lot of it seems to be this weird combination of some things that are bipedalism-y, namely that neck, and some things that are terrestrial quadruped-y, but not knuckle-walker-y specifically, mapping it with gorillas and chimps. And they finish this section by saying the combination of locomotor features of this femur indicates a complex locomotor repertoire. It includes aspects of quadrupedalism along with the presence of an early form of bipedalism. Okay, hold on. They think that the Osmaka femur has more bipedal characteristics than the Sahelanthropus chadensis femur does, implicitly suggesting that the Osmaka femur is a better candidate for what came immediately before hominins than Sahelanthropus is. They also argue that the Osmaka femur has characteristics more similar to terrestrial quadrupedalism as compared to suspensory adaptations, meaning that it looked more similar to knuckle-walking chimps in the femur than it looks to orangutans or gibbons, kind of softly suggesting that the last common ancestor of humans and chimps was like a generic terrestrial palmagrade looking thing, like walking around maybe on like its hands, like the palms of its hands and the soles of its feet, not unlike a baboon would. Except I know that David Berrigan in the past has proposed a knuckle-walking phase within human evolution, so he might propose some kind of generic suspensory guy earlier in the Miocene that then comes to the ground in something like the Osmaka hominine and is knuckle-walking, and then eventually it stands up on 2 feet. I think, and I'm totally speculating here, that that's kind of the soft suggestion, but there is a problem to me. I think a good case can be made for a very tiny amount of bipedal characteristics in the Sahelanthropus chilensis femur. I think that in combination with the anterior location of the foramen magnum and the small canine teeth in what is arguably a male suggests that we're looking at something that is hominin-ish, and insofar as we can clock a hominin with those characteristics, it does have a tiny, tiny little bit of them, and what else would we expect from something that is barely on the hominin side other than something with very few characteristics that would clock it as a hominin? Like, I think all of that is fair, although granted, it's hard to know for sure. The traits for bipedalism in the Sahelanthropus femur are slight and subtle. I will say that most people, when talking about Sahelanthropus chilensis, will say that that scrappy piece of femur looks awfully chimpy, and I do, on the whole, concur. We have to remember that on the whole, as we saw with the Osmaka femur, isn't the only thing that matters. And that's where the buck stops with the Osmaka femur. With Sahelanthropus, we had that beat-up cranium that has hominin signals in the location of the foramen magnum and in the reduction of the canine teeth. And we have those stupid forearms. We have those ulnae, which look like a suspensory animal setup. They look like orangutan ulnae. They look like this thing was hanging below the branches. So the writers of this paper note that the Osmaka femur looks like a slightly more derived version of the Sahelanthropus femur. And both of those femora look most similar to knuckle walkers like gorillas and chimps. Other people will recognize this. They explicitly do not draw comparisons to orangutan femora or to gibbon femora, which are suspensory. Except Sahelanthropus has suspensory-looking arms. Do you see what I'm saying here? How can we rule out the suspensory nature of the Osmaka hominine if we only have the femur? If we have clear other cases where the femur is looking like something that is not suspensory, and the ulnae are looking like something that is suspensory. Clearly, these combinations can exist. And the authors know this, right? They recognize this in a paragraph earlier in this same section where they say the absence of specialized arboreal features in the Osmaka femur does not mean that the hominine was an incapable climber. Arboreal attributes in australopiths, for example, are found more often in the upper limbs, along with evidence of terrestrial bipedalism in the lower limbs. The greater trochanter and the Osmaka femur, which is lower than the femoral head, is not as short as in australopiths and Homo, which makes sense given the geological age of Osmaka. This condition in the Osmaka femur could be interpreted as an indication for a capacity for arboreal climbing, perhaps most like Dryopithecus, while also consistent with terrestrial quadrupedalism. But why is the femur ruling out suspensory locomotion at all? I mean, I guess I should take a step back. They are mostly saying in this paper that it rules out specialized suspensory locomotion because suspensory climbers like orangutans and like gibbons do have features in their femora that are ostensibly related to how they move. But we have explicitly an example in Sahelanthropus, which they explicitly draw comparison to with regard to the femur, where we have a combination of something that looks really chimpy, really gorilla-y, really terrestrial quadrupedalism-y, combined with suspensory arboreal arms. All this to say, I still think the last common ancestor of humans and chimps was probably a generic, non-specialized, suspensory ape in the trees that was upright in its positional behavior, and then the trees went away, and then you had something that was more adapted towards being upright on the ground, or more predisposed towards adapting to being upright on the ground and bipedal on the ground. That's my opinion. That's my speculation. My personal beef with the knuckle-walking hypothesis aside is Gracopithecus and the Osmaka hominine. Are these guys early hominins? Should we consider them to be early hominins? And did hominins begin in Europe instead of Africa? I don't think it's a hominin, and neither do the authors. They say here, sort of at the end of the positional behavior section, overall, the combination of attributes in this femur is suggestive of bipedal positional behavior, but with biomechanical differences from later forms considered as true bipeds, as we saw in that multivariate analysis in that PCA. The differences in the bipedalism of Gracopithecus compared with later forms recall those that distinguish Australopithecines from Homo, suggesting that the acquisition of bipedalism in hominins was a multi-phase process. In isolation, a number of attributes of this femur can be found in generalized arboreal quadrupeds or in suspensory primates, but together they're most consistent with facultative bipedalism. Being a facultative biped isn't really the question. There are other proposed Miocene apes that have been proposed to be these facultative bipeds, as we said, in Danuvius and Oreopithecus. The question is it more like hominins than anything that came before, right? Is it possible that this guy, that Gracopithecus, is like the first thing that's pulled in the hominin direction? It is older than Sahelanthropus, and it's older than Auroran, and that's very tantalizing. First, we know that the environment is correct, right? They've reconstructed this paleo environment, and it's this woodland savanna dominated by open spaces. So it's the same kind of open landscape that's pockmarked by sort of groups of trees that I've proposed in the past, of course, taken from the literature, for the evolution of hominins in Africa. It's the right type of environment. So the question then becomes, did this happen more than once? Did we have this pressure for Miocene apes to become more bipedal in multiple different areas, both inside and outside of Africa? Or did it happen outside of Africa, and then those guys were sort of progressively driven into Africa, where they diversified into the hominins? It's tough to say because on one hand, we know that apes convergently evolve locomotor repertoires. This has happened again and again and again across ape evolution. And in the case of bipedalism, it's been proposed for the likes of Danuvius and to a lesser extent, Oreopithecus. But on the other hand, this is like a pretty clear bipedal signal in Graecopithecus, and other papers published on the craniodental material, scant that it is for Graecopithecus, and for closely related species like Oranopithecus and Anadaluvius, propose a slight reduction in the size of the canine teeth, which is the other of the two primary features that clock a hominin and start to differentiate them from the pannins. With just this femur, I don't think we can say it's a hominin, and the authors don't say it's a hominin. They say it's a hominine with some bipedal proclivities. We're going to read their conclusion here in a second. But if it's true that those canines are also reduced, then I might change my mind. I haven't had a chance to sit down and like really dig into it because it's Graecopithecus. It's just like this random late-term Miocene ape that previously there wasn't a lot of material for other than, the craniodental stuff. And there have been propositions for canine reduction in a couple of other Miocene apes, again, like Oreopithecus. But now I think we're going to have to get to the bottom of this. Let's conclude here, and then I'll give you some closing thoughts. They say, the morphology of the Osmaka femur is associated with a unique combination of locomotor capabilities that includes aspects of terrestrial quadrupedalism and bipedalism, but without special adaptations for suspensory arboreal locomotion. I think that whole second half of that sentence is kind of unwarranted, given what we know about Sahelanthropus, who also has aspects of terrestrial quadrupedalism / bipedalism in the femur, or at least it's proposed to have those bipedal aspects in the femur, and then those signals are completely contradicted, or I should say coupled with the suspensory signal in the arms, because critters don't decide their locomotor pattern by like one bone, but they're just saying what they can about what they have. So that's fine. They say the Osmaka femur does not show the features of habitual and obligate bipedalism of later hominins, but this is not surprising given its geological age. Our analysis reveals instead a unique transitional locomotor repertoire combining an early form of facultative bipedalism with terrestrial quadrupedalism with biomechanical differences from later bipeds. It's its own thing. So if it is a hominin, again, huge asterisk, potentially stem, going off on its own branch, a dead end. They say, we propose that bipedalism in the latest Miocene of the Balkans evolved in an open landscape setting from quadrupedal terrestrial ancestors, and that the Osmaka hominine represents a candidate for the ancestral form of positional behavior from which the habitual and obligate bipedalism documented in later hominins evolved. I agree with most of that. Again, though, I really don't think you can say that this femur is indicative of terrestrial quadrupedalism. Like, you need the upper limbs too to actually isolate that and preclude the suspensory stuff. Again, we just have other examples of different signals from the upper and lower limbs, so you need both of them to be confident in the locomotor repertoire, or at least in limiting the locomotor repertoire. They say the suite of selection pressures, including the need to exploit terrestrial resources in the face of dwindling arboreal ones, strategies for predator avoidance and resource detection on the ground, and the need to transport resources and offspring across open landscapes are all consistent with the morphology and the assumed ecology of the probable early Mycenaean Balkan hominine Graecopithecus and the described fossil from Osmaka. If the first characteristics that clock a hominin are a reduction in the canine teeth, a loss of that canine P3 honin complex, sexual monomorphism, and a scant few characteristics for bipedalism, then it is possible that the Osmaka hominin is actually the Osmaka hominin. I think it would be a very early stem hominin if that is what it is, and I don't think we have enough to say that that is, in fact, what it is, but it is, I think, on the table. That does absolutely nothing at all whatsoever to impact out of Africa as a hypothesis that has existed for many decades now, because out of Africa concerns Homo sapiens, or at the broadest, genus Homo. Also, I don't think that this femur in isolation provides good support for a terrestrial quadrupedal stage that precedes terrestrial bipedalism and comes after like some kind of general arboreal suspensory phase. I am still of the opinion that it's a lot easier and more parsimonious to go from upright in the trees directly to, generally speaking, upright on the ground. And I think that if you want to preclude that, you need more than just a femur, right? As we saw with other hominins who have drastically different signals in the lower limbs and in the upper limbs, but which are definitively belonging to the same animal. Man, we live in exciting times, paleoanthropologically speaking, positive, and also worldwide speaking in more of a negative sense. Luckily, as I was doing this video just last night, actually, we got another new Miocene ape drop, and this one is more towards the middle Miocene, so I'll be talking about it very shortly. In the meantime, if you like what I do around here, if you like this kind of thing and you want to support me in the free way, you can like, comment, and subscribe. You can give me your opinion on the Osmaka, femur, and Gracopithecus, and hominins, etc. I do try to read every comment. And if you want to support me in a more financial way, you can join my Patreon. Patrons get early access to videos when I'm on top of things, which right now I rarely am, but I have been in the past and I will be again in the future, so it's worth it. And they get their names at the ends of every video. So, speaking of which, I'd like to thank you from the bottom of my gentle and of course very modern heart for being such a curious primate, and I will see you real soon next time.